All right, we're going to get started. So thank you for joining us again. RTS Results for Strategy put an ongoing set of webinars. Those of you attending right now, you will be able to get a copy of this webinar. And also, if you go on our website, you'll see all the past webinars that you can download and play as you choose. Just to remind you, you're able to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll try and answer them as they come in, see if it's appropriate. Like I said, you will get a copy of this. And today, just so you're aware of it, we have a very detailed presentation. This is meant to be a very high-level presentation, and so we're going to go fast because there's a lot of content. When you get the playback, you'll be able to go through this much slower. We are going to send out a questionnaire that you can use for yourself later on to see how your brand's doing, but this has been a very popular topic. I know some of you are busy checking emails while you're listening to this. That's fine, but just be aware that because of the amount of content in here, you may miss some key points because it is one thing is built on top of another. So let's get into the agenda so you see what we're going to be talking about today, and then we'll go from there. So today's agenda covers every aspect of branding, from what is branding, how do you brand, what does marketing do in terms of the brand, in terms of the voice of the brand, how do you make your organization a brand first organization? And for those of you in the restaurant business, you know that in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was an operations driven organizational structure. For a while there, it got financially driven when PE groups got in, but more importantly now, you have to be brand driven. It's a real critical piece of how the world operates now. But we do have a lot of ground to cover. So let me start off by introducing myself, Fred LeBlanc, the founding partner of Results Through Strategy. And I call myself a chaos strategist because most of the world is in a whitewater world and there's a lot of disruption going on. So I'll let Steve Levine introduce himself, who's going to be carrying the big load here.
Good morning, I'm Steve Levine. I'm a branding partner at Results Through Strategy and formerly ran an ad agency for 35 years before getting into branding.
Steve, let's start with a simple question. What is a brand?
Well, the most important thing to know about a brand is that it takes place in somebody else's mind. So to that end, there's very little you can control about your brand, but everything you say and everything you do affects it. Your brand isn't what you say it is, it's what they say it is. Go ahead, Fred. So what does your brand promise? This is an important aspect of branding. It's what do you envision for your company and what is it that you're delivering? So if you look at the bottom, the words that are key are quality, consistency, fun, excitement, serenity, familiarity. Everybody's different, but you're promising something to your customers and you have to deliver on that promise in order for your brand to be consistent.
So a brand has got components and structural elements. So let's talk a little bit about brand DNA.
So your brand DNA is the essence of your brand, and we try and condense it into 3 words. So we've given you 3 examples here. Stetson, the Western cowboy hat, their brand DNA is independent, rugged, and truly American. So with just those 3 words, you get a pretty good idea what they're about. Southwest Airlines, any of you familiar with them? On time, low fares, and fun are the 3 things that they're known for. And recently we did a project for the Rainbow Room in New York, and what we came up with was Sublime Indulgent New York, which incidentally spells out sin.
So the thing with DNA is there's a show up in everything. This is a 360 view. So this is in all your marketing material, your uniforms, your concept development at the store level, your advertising, your messaging on social media. All this is important. And we're, on the basis of this webinar was that you're spending too much on advertising. So I'm going to show you how branding can work also within the use of social media. So how do we tell people who we are, Steve?
Well, the best way to do that is with a brand story. Now, what's interesting about a brand story is some of it isn't even told by you. It's everything you do, everything you present, everything you say. And it's also an actual story if you can come up with one. This may have something to do with the background, your history. Do you have recipes that came from grandma? Any interesting tidbits that help to build up your brand and give people more to chew on. A brand first organization is a company that recognizes that their brand is the most valuable thing they have. In this particular story, the executives of Coke, when asked whether they would prefer to keep their brand and start over with all new property, plant, and equipment, or keep their hard assets and start over with a new brand, they unanimously preferred keeping the brand. So that's where the real value lies these days. The other stuff can all be bought and set up again, but your brand, your reputation, what people think of you, the fact that they love you and are loyal to you, that's the difficult thing to do over again.
And as we said, just like DNA, a brand's got several components, some which were intangible and some that are not expressed of the operation. So Steve, break it down for us in terms of how the internal and external components work.
Well, internally, you have your brand vision, which is basically your idea of what you want your brand to become, and that's fixed. And then what's variable is your delivery. By what actions do you intend to fulfill your vision? Externally, you have your brand promise. What are you telling your customers? What is your commitment to them? And of course, the variable is your brand positioning. And that's always an ideal positioning. How do you want to be perceived? How do you want to be compared to your competition? And what's your competitive advantage?
Yeah, it's interesting to see today with the generational shifts that so many companies are struggling with. The ones that aren't is because they have a very clear idea of what their brand vision is and their brand promise. And while they may change menu items, change the core, they're not changing the essential nature of who and what they are. So you could think of Chick-fil-A or Starbucks. Now, Starbucks sort of lost their way there a little bit, but Howard Schultz brought them back. So if you're struggling with this boomer versus millennial challenge, you really should start back to your brand vision and purpose, understand why you exist and who you serve, and it'll make it easier for you to sort of figure out what to say no to. So let's get into brand positioning now.
So we start, if you look in the center, we start with brand DNA, then we develop our brand story, then we come up with what we want our desired brand position to be. What's important to realize is that the things you can control are the internal things: vision, mission, values, your personality, voice, and style, how you speak to people, what's the personality of the brand, the product you make, the process by which you make it, and the culture by which you run your organization. Externally, the things you can't control are the customer, what the customer says about you, the competition, the marketplace, and other outside forces and economic trends.
All right, well, we talked about Starbucks, so here's a good place to talk about what the difference is between a brand and a product. The best definition I've heard is if you take a product minus meaning, you have a commodity. If you have a product plus meaning, you have a brand. So Steve, let's now talk about what is branding, the actual process of branding.
Right, and specifically, what is restaurant branding? So restaurant branding is the practice of establishing a differentiated and relevant offering from food and service through ambience and marketing that attracts and retains loyal customers. Now that's the key thing. Because of what you serve, because of how you serve it, because of the what your restaurant looks like, feels like, sounds like, and tastes like, you have all these weapons to attract customers and make them loyal. What you would like to see happen is that your customers go from recognition to preference to insistence regarding your brand.
So the key question then, of course, is how do you create insistence? And the way we look at it is that if you study the way most restaurants operate, is they have financial targets and operating standards. And this is very typical of an operations-driven company, kind of the old school model. And then you have operations, the customer experience, what you do to achieve that, and then the outcome is what you do. What we try and do at Results Through Strategy is that we change the formula. We start through your why. Start with why. What's your brand purpose? And what do you need to do in order to deliver that purpose? And it's a big connection point is the employee journey. because the employees ultimately are the ones that are interfacing with customers. Now, we have an industry that shockingly accepts over 100% turnover every year as normal, and that's not normal. I just came from the People Report conference in Dallas, and the top companies there have very low turnover, very high tenure, because they really know how to engage the employee in their brand purpose. Then the guest journey is designed, and we do a lot of work around guest journey. We spend a couple of days with brands doing the guest journey and the employee journey and figure out what is the desired brand experience. And then we don't call it operations, we call it concept execution. Because if you have a brand personality and a brand voice, then the employees understand the need to execute the concept as defined by those values. And of course, we do have the standards of performance, that we have the behaviors that create the emotional outcome that we want. And what you want as an outcome is value for the guests, so they keep on coming back more and more, ever increasing sales and profits, and a sustainable model that can transition through whatever's going on in the world. And so it's this end-to-end journey that we talk about a lot.
So the customer need state is a very important thing for every brand to consider. Why do your customers come see you? What is the state they're in that causes them to want to be there? So if you look on the left, we have 4 examples. Is your place a peaceful escape? Is it something exciting? Is it a place to see and be seen? Or is it a familiar, homey place? So there are many others, but the question is, if you really understand your customer, and then you understand what their need state is and what it is that drives them to your restaurant.
So let's talk about that emotional connection, Steve.
Yeah, the truth is that we are not rational beings who occasionally get emotional. Humans are emotional beings who occasionally get rational. And the reptilian brain is where all the decision making takes place. And that part of the brain actually has no concept of language. So we're talking about gut reaction. That's how people make decisions. What feeds the reptilian brain are the emotions that happen in the limbic brain. And then of course the outside, the neocortex, is where you can remember your facts and figures and numbers and so forth. And that's how you communicate to each other, but it's all about feelings is where you really make the decisions. In biology, the emotional connection, the most important thing to remember from this is the bottom line here. People don't buy what you make or what you do. They buy into how you make them feel. That's probably the most important thing about branding to understand. People don't buy a meal, they buy a mood. And that's what they want to do, is change their feeling when they come into a place.
And the great restaurateurs recognize what this diagram shows you, because we all talk about wanting to have better employee or guest engagement. It's a combination of how you think and how they feel, the understanding of that to create the environment. And part of that environment is also the 5 senses. And so when we work with brands, we walk in and we look at the guest experience, not just from the standpoint of how we make them feel, but also what are they experiencing physically. If you think of a concept of delicious, and everyone here knows what delicious food is to them, and it's always very, very different, though pizza always seems to win #1 when I ask people what that is. Delicious is a combination of 4 senses: how it looks, how it smells, how it tastes, and how it feels when you bite into it. And it's that understanding of how to create these experiences through the senses to create an intangible sensation that is very, very important when we work with restaurants. So we're talking about emotional connections as well as creating a guest experience that's memorable. If you think about your earliest experience as a child, at whatever age you were, 3, 4, or 5, I guarantee you that it was an experience that was fused with emotion. In fact, I think the word experience is really an activity fused with emotion. And that's what we're trying to do in restaurants, is create that. So now let's get into how you brand a restaurant.
Okay, we have a number of steps here. There's going to be 6, and they all start with P, so it's easy to remember. So the first thing is you reveal your purpose. You figure out your why. Why do you do what you do? What motivates you? What's your vision for success? Go ahead, Fred. Next comes your product. So what is it about your product that you think there's demand for? How is it different from other products? What are your customers really buying? You know, it has been said that if customers are buying an electric drill, they're not really buying a handheld motorized device. What they're really buying is holes. And hopefully the holes are clean and true. And so the question is, what are your customers really buying from you? Are they really buying food? They can get that in a market. No, they're buying an experience.
And how does that fit into their lifestyles is an important piece of it. Understanding the problems you solve for them. If you have a double income, working family, what are you doing for them during the week that's different than you might do people who feel indulgent over the weekend? So that's an important part of it. So let's figure out who these people are.
So next thing is to identify your patron. So first there's a moderate amount of demographic. How old are they? What income class? Where do they live? More importantly, how do they get information, which tells you how to reach them? What is it that delights them, and what is it that's important to them? That comes from conversation and really getting to know your customers.
Or research as well.
Number 4 is position. To determine your desired position, we use a number of different positioning maps. This is an example of one that's very simple. Imagine that you have, say, fast food on the left of the horizontal axis and gourmet food on the right. Somewhere in the middle would be fast casual and casual dining. And then the environment from a sort of a cool, hip environment at the top and a warm, friendly environment at the bottom. So where would you place your restaurant? Where would you place your competitors? And if you find yourself lost in a sea of competitors, you might want to move to a different position. And in order to do that, you have to ask yourself, what do we have to say or do to be perceived the way we want to be perceived? Last thing, motivate your people. Fred, you've done more than that than me.
Well, the key thing here is the employee journey. I talked about this. How do you attract? How do you train? How do you retain them so that they stay with you for a long period of time and are connected to the brand purpose?
And then 6 is express your personality. And this is how you sort of anthropomorphize, sorry for the big word, your brand. Humanize it. If your brand was a person, what would he or she look like, act like? What would he care about? How old would they be? And very importantly, how would they speak? So you can imagine that there are different kinds of brands that speak in a different kind of voice because of who they're speaking to and because of what their brand personality is. This has to be consistent.
If it's Chick-fil-A, it's a cow that's talking to you, right? And that's how that works. And this graphic shows your brand wheel, all the different touch points that your brand has to show up in. So the way we bring it on home is through this graphic of here's your purpose in the middle and everything surrounds that. So we want to give you a quick case study, give you an example of how that works. So Steve and I had a chance to work at the Rainbow Room. The Rainbow Room is in the Rockefeller Center. It's an iconic place, a historical landmark. There are 2 basic facilities there. There's the actual Rainbow Room itself, and then there's a space that converts from the morning where it's in lunch, where it's the Rockefeller Dining Club, to the evenings where it becomes a Bar 65. And the challenge we had was how to differentiate it because the operation themselves did not understand how they could explain it, and they weren't doing well. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and explain this?
So for the Rainbow Room, the brand DNA was Sublime, Indulgent, New York. We gave that example earlier. The brand purpose was Joyful Indulgence. And it's epitomized by this picture here, where you can see what it is. The interesting thing about the Rainbow Room and how we came up with this is that we did some research about their Yelp reviews, and we found a review that said, is it expensive? It's way too expensive. Is it worth it? Yes. And so that told us where they were. They were without peer.
And the Rainbow Room has a lot of special private parties. It does dinner dances once in a while with a revolving wooden dance floor and a big band. Think of Cab Calloway in his heyday. The next space we worked on was the Rockefeller Dining Club, which was targeted to a very exclusive set of patrons, $10,000 a year membership, plus the cost of your meal for lunch and breakfast. And we wanted to be able to attract people and create an air of exclusivity up there, and this is what came up with. So go ahead, Steve.
So this is basically, you know, if you're going to belong to the Rockefeller Dining Club, it's because you know who you want to be around and who you want to eat with, and you don't want to be seen by anybody else. And so that's kind of what we're trying to communicate here. Elevated, exclusive, exceptional is their brand DNA, and ultimate privilege is their brand purpose.
And the same space turns into Bar 65 at night. And this is what we came up with for here. It's the
so Bar 65 is on the 65th floor, and it's outside, and it's got an unbelievable view of Manhattan. So swanky, spirited, and spectacular. It has a little more energy than the other two brands. Brand purpose is above and beyond because we're trying to, you know, push the spectacular view they have.
Great. So that gives you an idea. Now, each one of these took a long time to come up with. We can just whip it up in 15 minutes. We had to spend a lot of time to understand who we were, what we're trying to do, everything we talked about earlier in terms of the building blocks. So let's now begin to understand how better branding can equal better marketing. So in terms of your differentiation, the thing to keep in mind is that if you think about the restaurant category you're in, and if you were labeled that, let's say today you wanted to start your brand from scratch, what would be the top 10 things you would have to have in your brand in order to compete successfully? That might be in terms of the kind of food you have, the service style, the ambiance you have. Of course, every restaurant has to be tech-enabled nowadays because of the ever-changing nature of technology in restaurants. And then once you put that down, put your major competitors right next to it, and then ask the following question. How well do we execute these top 10 necessary things, the price of entry, the table stakes, versus our competitors? And if you're not at a 9 or a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, you've got to fix that right away. Because when you do the next part of the exercise, which is what is my point of differentiation, what are the top 3 to 5 things that I can do better than anybody else and nobody can touch me and that I own exclusively? It may be something like, for example, Chick-fil-A, to bring them back up, they're exceptional at service. They've taken service from the minimum standards necessary to elevated standards where they're so polite and so nice, people just can't believe they always have these smiles on their face. And then when you look at your 3 to 5 things that are your points of differentiation, rank them. How well do you execute them? If no matter how good your differentiation is, if it's built on a weak platform of the top 10 basics, the things that you need to do to be in the category, then it won't work. You have to have a very strong execution level of the basics, the price of entry, in order for your differentiational points to stand out.
Demographics actually do very little to help brands understand who their patrons truly are. You're probably going to attract people within a 5 to 10 mile radius, depending on what kind of restaurant you are. Millennials, for example, isn't a strategy. It's a date range. Brands are built and proliferated by humans who have behaviors and aspirations, and they want to portray their uniqueness and sense of belonging to the world. So brands provide elements much deeper than just their product and their service. They provide a badge that helps identify a person. Your customer is the type of person that likes to be seen at your restaurant, that likes to be treated at your restaurant, that feels good about themselves when they're in your restaurant. It's really important to understand what they're about.
So we talked earlier about restaurants going from being operation driven to financially focused and then brand first restaurants. Let's talk about how a brand first restaurant works.
So for most restaurants, they're spending all of their advertising dollars acquiring new clients. Unfortunately, acquiring a new client costs 7 to 10 times more than retaining an existing client. So this is where we're saying you're spending too much money on advertising. If what you're doing in advertising is either couponing or trying to attract new customers, take a good hard look at your brand. How well are you attracting loyal customers through the things you say, the things you do, and what's on your menu? So brand first restaurants can do the following in lieu of advertising. And I'm not saying it's unnecessary to advertise. You have to get some kind of awareness going. But once you have customers, build loyalty programs, increase sale averages with upgrades, merchandise, and deals that align with the things that make you special. Increase the average size of groups if you can by offering group discounts, by hosting parties. Basically, word of mouth is going to bring in your first-time diners. So your energies are always best spent engaging and retaining your first-time customers. And then once they're there and at the end of their visit, make an impression on them that they have such a great time, they'll spread the word for you.
Well, the key thing then is to realize why traditional advertising doesn't work. And this is one of the reasons. This was, I think, created by McKinsey. And you know, in the old days, the way it worked was consumers had a consideration set. They sort of window it down the funnel to figure out who to go to. They might have read a review in a newspaper, or might have possibly heard about a restaurant or an operation, gone there, they had the experience, they came home, that was it. It doesn't work that way anymore. What happens now is that the guest experience no longer begins at the front door and ends at the front door. It now begins on social media. The days of the formal restaurant critic are gone. People trust their family and friends. So when they're on social media and they hear through social media, which is an electronic form or a digital form of word of mouth, about an operation, a restaurant experience, there's photographs on Instagram, because Instagram is #1 marketing tool for restaurants nowadays. Facebook's good to go capture people as an audience. Instagram's we retain and engage them through visuals, because people are very, very visual. And so what happens now is when they go through the experience, and they've had it, they go back to the social media to comment on it and wait for all these likes saying, oh, I love that restaurant, that's my favorite dish, so forth and so on. And that's the revalidation that occurs for them that is very different than what used to happen 20 years ago. Steve, you had a comment?
Yeah, if you look at the loyalty loop, what's essentially happening is we're shortcutting the process from purchase to repurchase. And that's, if you'll notice, almost anything you buy these days, you're going to get an email from whoever that vendor is saying, how was your experience? How did you like it? Fill out, tell us what you think. And some of those are kind of a pain, but there's softer ways to do it and there's friendlier ways to do it. But that's the important thing is the timing. Right after they've enjoyed your product, you want to be there asking them how they liked it, asking them to come back, and inviting them for more.
And this is the advantage small brands have nowadays, because you don't have to have the big cannons of broadcast radio and television. You can actually have a bigger sense of market share and engagement than your competitors, because you're having a relationship with them. This is a dialogue. It's a two-way communication. It's not one way, like broadcast is just one way. This is two-way. And so let's look a little bit with some top 10 things in terms of brand strategies.
So these are 10 brand-based marketing strategies. The first is fanatical focus, and that just basically means if you do something that's exceptionally well done, people will give you credit for other things. So I like to give the example of Cheesecake Factory. When they first opened up, their tagline was world's best cheesecake. That's what they focused on. And people figured, gee, if they can make the world's best cheesecake, which is kind of an elusive recipe, they can probably make a pretty good burger and a pretty good salad. So they started going there. And now cheesecake is known for having probably the biggest menu in the country. So fanatical focus is something that can really pay off. Number two is tell your backstory. If there's an interesting story that led to the creation of your brand, you can share that. If not, you can make one up. So, but it's something else that gives people something to hang on to. Number three, be memorable. So this is really about the customer experience. How will you make your customer's dining experience unforgettable? There's lots of ways to do this. One of the favorite ways of restaurants that started in New Orleans is something called a lagniappe, which is a little gift at the end of a meal. Something hopefully that's particular to your restaurant, gives them something to remember you by. The very first introduction that your hostess makes and the very last goodbye that you make are particularly important places to bookend an experience and make sure it's a positive and memorable one.
So when we create guest journeys, we're looking for ways to have moments of truth throughout that guest experience as they're sort of passed around like a baton from the hostess to the server or the bartender, or whomever the case may be, back to the hostess, and make sure that the emotional impact is so strong. That's why Chick-fil-A is so powerful, because when you ask them for something, they're always saying, it's my pleasure. Of course, sir. Yes, ma'am. And these are important things. And memories, again, are activities fused with emotions. That's what memories are. And the key thing is that you have to ask yourself this question. When my guests leave the restaurant, are they planning a return visit because they have a desire to return? It's no longer the measure should be in terms of intent to return. Intent is a plan. Desire is a compulsion. They cannot wait to come back to have it all over again. And when they have that quality of experience, when they get on the internet, on Yelp, on Facebook, whatever the case may be, they'll say very, very positive emotional things about you. So on this one, and this is a little bit counterintuitive because we run into restaurants now that are looking to increase sales. I just happened to go to 6 conferences in the last 3 weeks, and there's still a lot of companies struggling out there with sales. Though we find that the independents are doing very, very well because I think you're giving a better guest experience. But everyone always wants to know, how can I grow sales? And what I tell them is start at your busiest times. Find out what your busiest hour is and see if you can increase the velocity of table turn at that busiest hour. And you usually can. It's usually a staffing issue, station size, or if it's a limited service counter, it might be more registers, more people on the cook line. Anything to improve your ticket times and speed of service and throughput. We've seen 3 to 5% increases on sales just by focusing on your busiest hours. And what happens when you make your busiest hour even busier, the shoulder hours get busier over time. And if you keep this practice going throughout, you will increase that day's sales significantly. On your slower shifts, we were playing more defense, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights or lunches. Then it's a little bit different. You might have those things like some casual restaurants do, half off wine on Tuesdays, or kids eat free on Monday night. Those kind of promotions build over time. It's 52 times a year, and you can begin to get a very targeted audience. And so while Monday nights may be slow, if you ever drive around a neighborhood of your restaurant, there's people eating in all the restaurants around you. Your goal is to get them into your restaurant. If you got all the customers eating out in all the restaurants around you on Monday night in your restaurant, you'd be busy. And that's the way to approach it. Start when you're the busiest and then go to the slowest. And that's what we talked about here. So it makes a big difference here.
And when the fish aren't biting, there's tricks that you can do to make your restaurant look like it's more successful than it actually would appear to be. So by reducing your dining space, if that's possible, it'll lend a feeling of fullness. And you can also do the same thing, if possible, to your parking area. There's no better testament to your popularity than a full parking lot or a full dining area. Number 6, make menus work for you. So a menu is more than just a list of things you're serving. There's, you can spend a lot of time in menu engineering and try and figure out which dishes should go where on the menu, what's on the right-hand page, what has a box around it, and all that stuff. But you can also make sure the menu is appropriately branded to match the look and feel of your restaurant, and that the menu speaks in the same tone as your brand.
And we do a lot of menu engineering work and price elasticity studies to see where you can do it. If you're a multi-concept or a multi-unit operation, you can have different prices in different locations, even if it's in the same city, because the crossover is not that significant. There's a lot of science that goes to this, but nowadays more than ever before, we find is that people need to keep their menus lean and mean. Cheesecake Factory has a kitchen that can handle a 150-item menu. Most restaurants do not have a kitchen designed for as many menu items as they have. And that's one of the things to keep in mind.
Fred, before I get into this, I wanted to go back for a second about when the fish aren't biting, because one of the things that I think is an interesting success story for restaurants is a restaurateur in Los Angeles, a very successful guy. Every time he opens a restaurant, he takes reserve signs and puts it on about 3/4 of the tables. So when you call up to try and make a reservation, chances are you're not going to get in. And if you do get in and you show up, you'll see all these reserve signs, and there'll maybe be only 15 tables open, and you'll wonder what's going on. But obviously you say to yourself, well, people are coming in later. Well, what he's really doing is twofold. One, he's giving his staff a break. He's giving his kitchen a break. They're getting used to taking care of the customers, and he'll take away the reserve signs with each passing day until they're able to handle a full load. The unexpected result of this, and the reason that he's continued it, is that he's creating demand. People want to go to a restaurant that they don't think they can get into. And so it sounds risky. It seems like the last thing you'd want to do when you're getting ready to first open a restaurant, but it works. So now we're at number 7, maximizing the dining experience. So this is really a question of how do you best represent your brand in the dining experience? What's the atmosphere like? What's the service like? How's the food presented? And above all, a basic understanding of how your client deserves to be served.
This is an interesting area because I was just with a bunch of restaurant designers, and now the conversation is, how do I design my restaurant so it looks good on social media when they take pictures in my restaurant? We have designers that are very carefully placing lights so when people take Instagram shots, it looks more attractive because these are not professional photographers. They're even creating little stage sets so that if people are going to take a picture of themselves as a selfie, they're going to do it in an interesting spot in the operation. So the world is really changing as a result of this digital experience. And that's why you want to really think about it in a different context. We all know we should have clean restaurants, and clean bathrooms, and well set up tables. But now think of it from a social media standpoint. How does your restaurant look on a 6x4 screen?
And don't forget the 5 senses. If your restaurant is a buffet restaurant, for example, if there's a station that you put in that has something sizzling or something steaming, you've just added a whole new sensory experience to what is otherwise basically just a market experience. Excuse me. Number 8 is make your employees the stars. Ensure that everybody that works for you understand the brand and understand they're able to speak in the language of your brand. Every employee should be encouraged to be a brand ambassador. And they do that by the way they behave and what they say and how committed they are to serving the customers in the way they want to be served. This builds customer loyalty and it just get rewards in spades.
And when I talked about the employee journey earlier, when we work on that, we look at the pathway that an employee has from the interview process. Are they made to feel welcome? Are they made to feel special? Are they acknowledged? Is someone waiting for them? And if they get hired, making sure that the first day on the job is a celebration. Because everyone, when they go home, their first in the job, is the immediate question is, how was your first day? And if it was spent filling out paperwork or going through some drudgery, that's not a good impression. You can do that paperwork separately. The idea is to make them feel welcome, have everyone know them by name, have a bit of a celebration, lunch with the manager, whatever the case may be. So when they go home, they're convinced that they made the right decision. And this employee engagement starts by the interview process and carries every step of the way while they're going through training and how can they maintain retention. I heard a great story from a restaurateur who's opening up a restaurant in Denver, and his top 3 people, his chef and his GM and his assistant manager, were approached by the competition to come and work for them for 30% more salary. And all of them turned down the competition and said, a 30% greater salary is not going to fulfill me as much as where I work now. And that's a powerful statement because money does matter. But what you find out when you have your employees tied to a purpose, they will stay loyal to you.
Number 9, market to influencers. Find out who the influencers are in your neighborhood. You'd be amazed how much attention you can get by marketing to hotels, airports, visitor centers, because they're valuable prospects. Realtors, can we go back to that? Realtors, bankers, schools, and large employers are other opportunities. So give everybody a menu. Make sure they're aware of any promotions that you have going. Give them samples, free gifts, free meals, so they'll feel compelled to recommend your restaurant.
Great. And now we're going to get into probably the hottest area in restaurants right now is delivery. And delivery is big. Keep in mind that on delivery, most people charge about a 30% fee. If you have a 40% flow through, that means you're only making 10% in incremental dollars. Delivery definitely is accretive to sales. I've got some concepts that have gone up to 15% of sales of delivery, and they're happy with it. But remember, once you use a third-party delivery, that customer is no longer yours. It now belongs to the delivery company, because when they go to the delivery company's websites, they're going to be presented with a collection of restaurants. They may be initially going in there to order from you, but they may see someone else right side by side to you that they prefer to do. So it's something to be careful on. We've done a lot of conversations about delivery. I've led some panels on this. There's this whole issue of what happens to your brand when someone you don't even know picks up food in a car that you've never seen before. How is it delivered? What if he drops it? What if there's a mistake? There's a lot of things in delivery that you need to be aware of. Clearly, it's something we need to think about as the consumer is becoming an on-demand customer, not just what I want to eat, but where I want to eat it. But there's a lot of pitfalls here you have to be careful with. And in the future, we'll have a webinar on delivery by itself. So now let's get into a little bit of what's happening with social media and how you can begin to build your brand from there.
So these are just quickly 10 online brand building rules for getting involved in social media. Number one, don't skimp on the food photography. Take great photos of your food. Number two, offer mobile loyalty programs. Number three, be consistent on your social media, Yelp and Google. Make sure that if somebody's going to look you up, all the right information is there. Make sure they have the current menu. Make sure that all the information and the phone number and everything is right, because this is where an enormous percentage of people are finding you. If people are making comments about you, respond to everything, both positive and negative. Don't give excuses, but respond in an understanding way. If it's something positive, thank them. If it's something negative, you can apologize, offer them to give you another chance. Come on in. But make sure and not ignore anything. Don't let anything sit out there. Number five, engage your audience by sharing their content. Don't just speak to your audience about what you're doing, but ask them to participate. They have more credibility than you do in social media. Number six, be clear about your personality and your identity. Remember, you're talking in your brand's voice. Number seven, be sure your updated menu is online. Number eight, show off your staff. Let your staff participate in social media. Give them the rules to do so. Make them understand the voice so they're doing it right. Number nine, always concentrate on your USP, the things you do better than anybody else. And number 10, monthly, check your online presence and make sure it's all up to date.
There's several companies that can help you do all these things for a cost-effective way. We've had great success working with a company called Centric, where they collect all the social media comments from like 12 different websites. You're able to respond individually to consumers. They do reputation management. They check your listing on Google Maps and Apple Maps and all sorts of things nowadays you have to think about. This is a very large area, and if you don't have a marketing person that understands this, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but we can help you through that. So let's do a quick checklist in terms of how you can tell whether or not you're doing a good job in brand building.
So we say the first step is to write a manifesto, and this doesn't have to be anything long, but it expresses your beliefs, where you came from, why you do what you do, and what values are important to you. The next thing is to empower your employees to become your brand ambassadors. 3, identify why somebody should buy from you and not your competitors. So you get to understand the need state of your customers and why it is that you fulfill that need state better than anybody else. Excuse me. Number 4, complete a buyer persona or a message matrix and get to know your audience. So a message matrix simply says, what kind of customers do I have? What is it that troubles them? What is it that makes them happy? What is it that I'd like to say to them? What is it I'd like them to know about us? So that's another full day exercise that we do, the message matrix, but it basically just helps you understand that you're hitting all the salient points when you are communicating with customers. Number 5, craft a brand story and share it. Number 6, develop your brand's personality. Try and come up with a picture and a description of who a real person would be that would represent your brand. Number 7, find your brand voice and use it across all your materials, from your website to your signage to your menu. And number 8, design your brand's look and feel based around all these attributes of your brand.
So as we wrap this thing up, as we said, this is a very large overview. Some of these areas could take an entire webinar by themselves. Steve, why don't you give us your closing statement here?
Well, so in closing, really, you have to learn to set your brand free, because you can't control everything about your brand. People are going to talk about you. So the most important thing you can do is listen, learn, and respond. The secret to success is enhancing your patrons' self-esteem. If somebody feels better about themselves when they come into your place, they're going to come back. Give them a reason to feel good about themselves, they'll return. And remember, they're not buying a meal, they're buying a mood.
That's great. Well, I do have a couple of questions here that I want to raise. One of them was, how long do some of these different component parts take? So a brand strategy session where you go through a lot of the early parts of this webinar, take about a day and a half to 2 days. Building a guest journey and an employee journey takes a day each. And creating the message matrix in and of itself could take an entire day, because you're trying to understand who your personas are that you're appealing to. We always encourage restaurants to do some form of segmentation study and research, because it really objectively lets you know who your customer is. You can't see anecdotal evidence that way. A good example is a family restaurant. If you take a canvas and people say, how many kids are in this restaurant? They'll say, oh, 80% of the people have kids. And the reality, in some cases, we find out that 10% have kids, but they're so damn noisy, they sound like they're everywhere. And so you can't rely on anecdotal information in today's world. It's just too competitive. There's too much information that needs to be taken care of at that time. I sent an email out, a little note to everyone out here. If you want to get a copy of our guest journey or employee journey webinar, send an email to info@resultsthroughstrategy.com, and we'll send you a link so you can view it and download it. And as I mentioned earlier, this webinar will be made available to you next week once we get a chance to download it and clean it up. And I want to thank you all for participating today. We appreciate the fact that you signed up, took an hour out of your busy day, and look forward to seeing you again in our next webinar. Thank you very much.